It's actually quite a simple system. Before 2016, there were tax rules that applied to living trusts and testamentary trusts. And I'll just say will trusts because usually testamentary trusts are set up in a will. And with the living trust, if the trust earned any income, it paid tax at a flat rate of 44% if the income was kept in the trust. Now, a trust is ultimately a flow-through vehicle. So if the trust earns $100, the trustee can say, okay, I'm going to keep that $100 in the trust because I don't want to give it to Johnny. Or the trustee, and in that case, the trust, if it's a living trust, would pay $44 in tax on that 100. It pays as if it was a millionaire. It pays at the top rate. Or the trustee can say, okay, I've got that income coming in. I'm going to use that for the benefit of Johnny, and I'm going to flow that income out to him so he pays tax on it. And he pays tax at, say, 20%, so it's a lower rate of tax. So the trustee can make that decision, either pay tax in the trust or flow it out to Johnny. Now, if Johnny's in a low rate, you flow it out, unless that's going to put him offside of government benefits, and then you might say, okay, the lesser of the two evils is I pay the high rate of tax, but now I got the $56 that I can use for Johnny later. Now, most of the time, people were setting up pension trusts in wills because then even if the income was taxed inside the trust was treated as a separate individual. So it got graduated rates. So it didn't pay 44% on each dollar. It paid as if it was an individual. So you paid 20% on the first $30,000 of income, and then a higher rate as your income gets higher. So that was a real advantage for trusts for disabled individuals, because you could say, okay, I don't want to pass it through to Johnny because then he's going to have too much income. He'll be cut off government assistance. I'll pay the tax inside the trust, and then I have that capital that I can use for Johnny in a later year. And,
but you get the low rates.
But I get the low rate, so it's tax paid.
Yeah.
And that was the main difference. There were other differences here. But unfortunately, the government felt that people could set up these will trusts for anybody, for non-disabled individuals as well. And the government thought that there was some avoidance of tax going on. You know, because if I had 5 children, I could set up 5 separate testamentary trusts, one for each child, and then I could split income from the estate. And the government thought that this was an unmerited tax benefit. So they are changing the rules starting in 2016. So we've got a different set of rules that we have to deal with. So starting in 2016, testamentary trusts or will trusts and living trusts are going to be subject to the same rules. So any income that's taxed inside the trust is taxed at top rate of 44%. There's an important exception, is the qualified disability trusts, which we will talk about after lunch, I guess. And basically the qualified disability trust, if there's an individual who qualifies for the disability tax credit and who is specifically named as a beneficiary of that trust, any income that's used for the benefit of that disabled beneficiary will still get the graduated tax rates. So originally the government was just going to say, okay, no graduated rates at all. And then various people made representations to the government and said, well, this isn't really fair because there are disabled people who need these mechanisms. So the government has said, okay, we'll allow the graduated rates to continue to apply as long as one beneficiary qualifies for the disability tax credit. But it really means that it's only the income being used for the benefit, ultimately, of that disabled beneficiary that gets this treatment. So It means that you don't have to pay. You can set up a trust in the will. The money can still be used for the benefit of the disabled child, now an adult, and you don't have the tax penalty. You can still have it taxed at graduated rates, lower rates of tax inside the trust. Preserve the capital for later on. Now it's tax-paid money, so it can be distributed, used for Johnny's benefit in a future year. He doesn't have to pay tax again because tax has already been paid at the low rate. But now you've got that fund for when government assistance ceases. So there's fund is there for taking care of needs, for paying fees, for helping set up community support groups. So that's still an option. You will hear various people saying how, the rules have changed, but as long as you have a child who qualifies for the disability tax credit, it's still a possibility to get the graduated rates. Now that means that the disability tax credit is very important. So you want the child, and I assume that you all know about the disability tax credit?
We're going to talk more about that as well. We have a whole slide about it. Yeah.
But you want to get your child qualified for the disability tax credit. They get qualified while they're minor, and then once they become 19 and they're an adult, then they have to re-qualify periodically. So you have to have a medical practitioner fill in the form saying yes, they still have those challenges that they have to meet. And so it's very important to get that designation. And we'll talk more about that, but that prelude was just to set the general stage for disability trusts. So do you want, in case I've messed that up, do you want to go through the tax basics for trusts again just to re-emphasize it?
Sure. Okay, so some tax basics for trusts. The trust will pay tax on all of its income, like Blair mentioned, if it doesn't flow it out to the beneficiaries. So trusts actually have to fill in a tax return. So they're not a separate legal individual. We've been saying that several times, the way that I am a separate legal individual from Blair and each one of you. And if I started a corporation, that corporation would also be a separate legal individual. Trusts aren't separate legal individuals, but they're separately taxed. So there are trust tax returns that have to be done if you decide to set up a trust. For example, you need to do a tax return for the trust. And if the trust makes income, then it's going to pay tax. Or it can flow it out to the beneficiaries, like we were saying, and then it's not going to have to pay tax.
The beneficiary pays tax.
The beneficiary will pay tax, yes. So tax will be paid somewhere. So if it does distribute income to beneficiaries, then it will deduct that income from its income.
Yeah, and the beneficiary will pay the tax at the beneficiary's rate, which if you're flowing it through, the beneficiary is at a lower rate, probably.
Most likely, yeah. Depending on who your beneficiaries are.
Yeah. Now, you used to be able to use trusts for splitting income with children under the age of 18. That's no longer the case. There's a thing called a kiddie tax. So if you have a trust and the trust pays money out to somebody under the age of 18, that's taxed at top rates because the government was noticing there were a lot of 2-year-olds with big incomes. So they stopped that. So the trustee has a choice. You can pay tax in the trust or you can distribute the income to the beneficiary. And so that's the flexibility coming in. If you
have a discretionary trust.
Of discretionary trust. So if you don't say that the trustee has to distribute the income, the trustee has that choice. Now, because living trusts pay tax on all their income at the top rate, they tend to distribute everything. Testamentary trusts traditionally have mixed and matched, and after 2016, if your testamentary trust qualifies as a disability trust, it will probably continue to mix and match on that strategy. Now, the one thing about trusts that I should cover is that there's an income tax rule that if a trust is in existence, every 21 years the trust is deemed to dispose of its assets at fair market value. That means that if the trust has an accrued capital gain, it has to pay the capital gains tax every 21 years.
Okay, there's a lot of words in there. So let's slow down a second.
Okay.
First of all, what is deemed? Second of all, what is a disposition? Third, what's a capital gain? And what's capital gains tax is fourth.
Oh, okay. So, you know how a deemed disposition is, there's no actual sale, but the income tax department wants to collect its money, so it pretends that you sold it for fair market value. So let's say I bought some shares of, Microsoft. They're still a good company, aren't they? Yeah. So let's say I bought shares of Microsoft and I paid $5 for the shares, and the shares are held in a trust. And now it's the 21st anniversary of the trust, so the shares are now worth $25. So the tax department says, well, you've been holding those shares a long time. We're going to pretend that you sold them for $25. Now I've got a $20 capital gain. So they've increased in value by $20. So now I have to pay tax on that. So I have to pay 22% tax as the top rate on a capital gain. So now, I used bad numbers because they can't do the math. But I've got to pay $22. I've got to pay
22% of $20.
Yeah. So
you
let's
don't
say
have to give the actual answer.
let's say my gain.
Someone's really good at math in here. I know.
Let's say I was a better investor and I had a $100 gain. I got to pay $22 in tax. Now, I pay the $22 in tax and I can keep going. So I probably actually have a sale of some of the shares so I can pay the tax. But there's a misconception that a trust can only last for 21 years. That's not the case. A trust can last for 80 years, 100 years, a long time. But every 21 years you have this tax issue. Mm-hmm. So I can certainly say, okay, it's liquid assets. I can sell some of the assets. I pay the tax. I keep the trust going. Now, it's a problem if it's a non-liquid asset. If it's shares of a private corporation, there's not an easy market for those. So that's where...
Or real estate.
And
that's the only thing the trust holds.
Yeah,
how are you going to pay the tax bill in 21 years? So it becomes...
You might have to sell the real estate, but you have to sell the whole real estate.
Yeah.
So that changes the investment focus of the trust. Because if the trust has a commercial building and it's earning good rental from the building, and then it's got this deemed disposition and it has to pay the tax, well, one option is to sell the building, but now you've got to take your after-tax money and invest it in something else. Maybe the trust borrows money to pay the tax and then repays the loan. So it's going to be a decision based on the assets of the trust, the income that's coming in from those assets. But one option is to terminate the trust and distribute the property out to the beneficiaries, and that can be done on a tax-deferred basis. So if my beneficiary is resident in Canada, I can just say, okay, I don't want to pay the tax on this deemed disposition. I'm going to pass the assets out to the beneficiary so that now the beneficiary owns the asset. So now I don't have a deemed disposition on the 21st anniversary because the trust doesn't have anything left. I passed the asset out, and I can do that without triggering the tax. But if the beneficiary is on government assistance, and now I passed out an asset to the beneficiary, and that asset is more than $200,000, the government assistance is gone. So I got to juggle those things. So it may be that I keep the trust going, I pay the tax because that's better for the beneficiary. I have that choice. So it's just a tax rule that has to be dealt with every 21 years. And why 21 years, you ask? Who knows? It's just that the government doesn't want people to defer capital gains tax too long. The 21-year, the main thing is there's flexibility, so it's not a disaster. And if your trust is investing in GICs, then you don't have a capital gain because, if I have a $1,000 GIC, I earn interest on it. And the interest I pay tax on each year, but the GIC is not going to grow in value because, I bought the GIC for $1,000. On maturity, I get $1,000 back. So that isn't going to change in value. It's only things like stocks, real estate, that increase in value over time. I can sell it for more than I paid for it. That's where I have the capital gain come in. Everybody got that concept of capital gains? Yeah.
Define what a GIC is?
Oh, sorry. GIC is a guaranteed investment certificate or a term deposit. So that's where I go to a bank and I give money to the bank. I lend money to the bank, and then the bank pays me interest. Now, at the moment, they pay a very low rate of interest because interest rates are low. But in a different interest rate environment, nowadays I get 1%, 2%. That is taxable income to me, and at the end of 5 years, the bank gives me my $1,000 back. But I'm just getting the loan that I made to the bank is repaid, so that's tax-paid money. So that's not a capital gain. There's been no increase in value. Now, if I invest in a bond, sometimes corporations will issue bonds, so I'm lending money to the corporation, but I'm lending the money to the corporation for 25 years, so they're going to pay a higher interest rate. Now, I include that interest in my income, but if interest rates go down, then my bond with a 5% interest rate might get more valuable. So somebody might be willing to pay me, maybe I bought the bond for $1,000, but because I've got such a good interest rate, maybe somebody will pay me $1,005 for the bond. So that $5 difference would be a capital gain. But usually bonds, at the moment, interest rates are so low that bonds are not going to go up in value. They're more likely to go down in value as interest rates rise. So anything that fluctuates in value, like shares of Microsoft, shares of Apple, shares of BlackBerry, they went down. But anything that, you can have a gain or a loss on it.
But it's still capital property.
But it's still capital
Even if the value
property.
goes down, it's a capital loss as opposed to a capital gain. So certain kinds of property are capital property and other kinds are income generating, right?
Yeah. So, and that's the only thing that the 21-year deemed disposition rule affects. If you don't have a capital gain because you're investing in guaranteed investment certificates or term deposits, you don't have to worry about it. If you do have a capital gain because you own shares of Microsoft, you can sell some of the shares, pay the tax, keep the trust going. The main point is you can keep the trust going for 80 years, 100 years. It's not limited to 21 years.